over at the very end, because I have quite a lot of material to go through. So I'll be more than happy to leave 10 minutes towards the end to answer any questions people might have. So I hope that's okay. So let's get us started. A little bit about me. My name is Flavio. As mentioned, I'm calling you guys today from Birmingham, UK. I've been here for the last 8 years. I'm a Microsoft certified data analyst and also a BI developer and managing consultant at a company called Logical Projects. So the agenda for today consists mainly of 5 different visualization techniques I want to walk you guys through. But before we get stuck on that, I think that first point is really important, the data visualization principles I want to highlight to you. And I think that's really important to set the scene and to make sure that the techniques we're going to apply are effective. So on this point here, on these principles, what I want to say is that your first port of call should be, as far as possible, the main visualizations or the native visualizations inside Power BI, because those are quite extensive and in many cases will allow you to achieve your goals. And only if those do not allow you to achieve what you're after, then you will look into one of these techniques we're going to go through. So I think it's important that you don't start with a solution and try to find a problem for it. You do the other way around. You have a problem and you're trying to find the most effective technique to solve that problem. So I'll be spending a few minutes talking about these principles, and then we're going to get stuck into some demos. I'll try to make this session quite interactive and dynamic. So I hope you will not feel bored, and hopefully as well, you'll take away some interesting ideas for your own reports. So if that sounds good, let's get us started. So the first principle I like to point out is that we need to know what we're going to build before we start building it. So I'm a big fan of requirements gathering, and what you see here is the template I personally use before starting any solution to understand what is the main goal, what are the KPIs we're trying to hit, who is the audience, what are the features we are developing, and also not developing. That's also as important many times. And there on the bottom right, you can see a link where you can download this if you want. Now, you don't have to use this template right here, but I would highly recommend you use something. It needs to be something that you follow consistently every time you develop a solution so that you know what the end results should be. If you don't do that, I think the end product is going to suffer. And unfortunately, we see lots of Power BI reports that suffer from that problem. If this isn't clear at the beginning, then everything is a lot harder as you start working. So you've gathered your requirements, then point number 2, I'm a big fan as well of sketching it out. So if you know the end result you're going for, it doesn't take a lot of time to do a little sketch of what you envisage the solution is going to be. You don't even need to make it as fancy as that right there. You don't even need colors, but you should have a rough idea at this stage of the layout you want to follow, the menus, the buttons, what's the color scheme you're going for. So doing a little sketch is a very good way to make sure that your end product is going to achieve the goals that you've gathered on step number 1 on the requirements gathering. All right, step number 3. I won't go into a lot of detail on this one. I'm just broadly saying stick to the basics. And to help with that, what do I mean by basics? I have a link on the presentation to this booklet from Microsoft, which will present some of those rules you should be trying to follow. For example, embracing clarity. Don't do what's on the left, do the example on the right. I don't think I've seen people do 3D charts like that in a long time, which is good, but you should be trying to strive for good color scheme, good contrasts, making sure you have legends and you have a context on your title. So those should be basic things that you're striving for. Then further down, we have things like consistency. Make sure your color palette is consistent on the page and across the report. Again, something that shouldn't be very difficult to do when it goes some way to increase the quality of your products. And then something that actually gets forgotten many times, which is readability. And the readability, you could look at that as making reports accessible for all users. And you have to consider people with vision impairment, for example. And contrast is a big factor in making your report accessible. So this tool right here tries to look at the colors you're trying to come up with in your report, and it will give it a ratio. That's called the contrast ratio. For example, if I have black font on top of white background, that's a contrast ratio of 21. You can see a preview here. So that's pretty good. That's as good as it gets. But now if you start to change the color of the font, you can see a preview there. That's going to start to fail these accessibility tests. So this is a very, very good tool to make sure that your report is accessible to everyone, and really something that is good to have in mind. All right, so back to the presentation, stick to the basics. We've talked about accessibility. And the final thing I'll mention on this section is picking the right tool for the job. And by this, I mean more specifically, picking the right chart to tell the story you're trying to tell. So there's also a link to this website right here, and someone did a great job of creating a Power BI report with visualization types that you can use to tell a certain story. For example, if you're trying to do ranking of values, you will see a number of different visual types you can use to tell that story. For example, bar charts or column charts, lollipop charts, bump charts. There's a whole host of visual types you can use. And again, I would recommend that you have this in mind before you start to build your solution, to make sure that the visuals you're selecting are effective and are telling the story that you want to tell. All right, and to wrap up this session, this section here, let me bring up a case study. And this is from a gentleman called Stephen Few. He runs this website called Perceptual Edge. And Stephen Few is well known. He has actually some very well-known books in the area of data visualization. This one here, Show Me the Numbers, is quite well known. And on this website, he has a number of case studies that prove the point that you should be trying to choose the right visual to tell the story you want to tell. So this one right here, this tree map, was shown on the Guardian newspaper here in the UK. And what it's trying to achieve is compare the UK budget deficit, which is this black box right here. It's trying to compare that against other amounts to put that into perspective. And the author of that article chose the tree map to do that. So Stephen Few has a very interesting analysis here, but in a nutshell, he says this chart is not very effective. And the point he makes is that, for example, I cannot tell straight away if the budget deficit is half the bailout amount. I have to struggle really to read those labels and figure out that, okay, it's a little bit less than half, but I have to work really hard to understand that. And that's because the chart is asking us to compare areas, which is something the human brain struggles quite a lot to do. The whole reason why pie charts are hated in the data analytics community, but we're not going to go into that now. There's other aspects here, for example, in terms of the colors. For example, there's blue boxes inside pink boxes. We're not quite sure what that means. And someone pointed this out in a training session a few days ago, that there's actually 2 shades of blue here. And that should stand for spending. What does the light blue mean? So there's a few things wrong and that make this chart quite hard to convey the message. So scrolling down, Stephen Few has redone the chart, pretty much taking the same data, and he's done a simple bar chart, which, by the way, most of the time will be a very effective visual to convey your story. And he's put the budget deficit here in the middle as a vertical black line. That's the focus of the data, of the message. And then very easily you can rank all the other amounts and more easily compare that against those amounts, which was the point in the first place. So what I'm trying to say with this is that the medium does matter to convey your message, especially in data visualization. It's something to bear in mind. Recommend you have a look at other examples on this website. There's other very interesting articles that he's written, and yeah, the books are also very good. All right, so that is the principles. So now we'll move to the 5 techniques, and the first thing I want to be talking about is Python and R scripts. I'm not going to be spending a whole lot of time on this, simply because it's been around for quite a long time, but for completeness, I wanted to touch on it. So let's head over to Power BI and let's see how we can get Python working for us. So the first thing that you will want to do is to install Python on your machine, and I've already done that. If you want to do it, there's an article I'm linking here from Microsoft that tells you what the steps are you got to follow to install Python in your machine. Then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to use the Seaborn package inside Python. There's a whole host of packages that you can use. We're just going to stick with this one. It's a well-known package inside Python. And we're going to try to represent a very simple chart to showcase what you do. I have the code written here already, and I'm just going to drop that onto the visual. And if I wait a little bit, I should see the results being plotted there. For context, the only thing we're doing is importing the libraries or the packages we're going to use, and then we're generating dummy data. That's pretty much what I'm doing there. 1,000 points with a gamma distribution and a normal distribution, and then I'm just plotting that with a Seaborn package. And then you can see what happens. So this chart gets generated. I would class this as a mix between a scatter chart in the middle and a histogram there on the sides. And that's basically telling you the distribution of the values inside the scatter plots. You cannot do this by default in Power BI out of the box. If you have a specific requirement, again, we come back to what I was saying, you need to be trying to solve a specific problem to use these tools. If you have that requirement, then you'll be able to do something like this. If I come back to the code, then the type of things you could do is edit the properties. So for example, if I want to have this in red instead, you'll see the color will change. And if I come here to the Seaborn package documentation, you see there's a number of different options you can use. So if I want to represent a histogram instead of hex, I will change that property there. And if I wait a few seconds, you will see that the type of chart will change there in the middle. So this is to show you that all of this is configurable. I could now change the axes and the colors and the background, so it's fully editable. Really, really powerful in the right scenario. So that's all I will say on R and Python. Point number 3, though, if you have the need to use it, be aware of limitations. There's a page here by Microsoft that will tell you what this can and cannot do. There's limitations in terms of number of rows, for example. Licensing, that's also important. You need paid licensing to use this on the browser. So if you publish this to Power BI service, you need either Power BI Pro or PPU, Premium Per User. And beware that if you're going to publish this to a external facing website, publish to web, you're not going to be able to do that with Python visuals. Okay, so that is this section. Now I want to move on to SVG. And let me bring up this online editor that will help us understand what SVG is if you haven't worked with this before. So that stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And that's a complicated way of saying that visuals drawn using SVG have always perfect resolution, so you can zoom in and out as much as you want. They never lose resolution. So actually things you can see on this website are very likely drawn with SVG elements. But if I show you what this actually looks like here on this engine, it's a lot more easy to understand. So we have the properties of the visual on the left and the visual itself drawn on the right. The benefit is that if I want to change its properties, for example, the stroke to black and the fill to red, and I run that, you see that gets redrawn dynamically. And if I change the radius to 30 pixels, I'm now starting to change the properties of this SVG. And that's how this can become quite useful for us inside Power BI. So let me show you what you can do to harvest SVG inside Power BI. So if I come back here, you need two things to be able to draw SVG elements inside Power BI. First of all, you need a visual that can render those elements. So the one I like to use is that one HTML content, and you'd get access to that by using the app shop, and you can get that visual from there. And the second thing you do is a measure. So I've literally copy and pasted that measure from the online editor onto here. Just bear in mind that you'll need to replace double quotation marks with single quotation marks for this to work. And I've simply dropped that onto the HTML reader. So to prove that this still works, I can make the stroke green and the fill black. And if I do that, update the measure, you can see this is rendered here inside Power BI. Now you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good. That's a circle. That's very simple. What really can I do with this? So now I'm going to move on to show you a few more practical examples of what you can do with this approach. So this right here is an example of a report I did some time ago for a Power BI competition. And what I was trying to do with this was represent Premier League fantasy football data and represent that inside a Power BI report to measure players' performance effectively. So the radar chart you see here in the middle is an SVG element. Again, because I could not find a visual that did what I wanted, and that's how I decided to then use this approach. So after you know what I've just shown you, that measures can generate SVG, this is actually not very difficult to do. We're basically generating two triangles where the vertices will change based on the player's data. Then I simply applied a bit of color, a bit of transparency, a bit of shadow to it, and you'll get the result you see on the screen. Now the advantage is that if I change the player, so if I look at that guy instead, then the chart will get redrawn for that player. And the DAX will just read the data and update the chart accordingly. So that's quite a neat feature that you can use. And again, I did not find a suitable visual. That's why I moved on to this approach. So if you're not familiar with football fantasy, there's some tooltips here that explain what the terms mean, what does form mean. And if I look there at costs, I'll be able to see the evolution of the player price with time. This element here explaining the position a player plays in is also an SVG element. And I'll just show you the report really quickly. If I go to player stats, again, I try to represent data in a different way. This was the point of the competition. I was trying to try out different techniques. So you can see how many goals they've scored, how many assists, if they're a goalkeeper. We'll have the number of saves there. And if I go to league overview, this page here looks at a thing called value. And the value basically means that the player performs the best for the least amount of money spent. So that's the most valuable player at the time the data was refreshed, was this guy right here. And we can even interact with the scatter chart, showing different combination of costs and points for players. And finally, if we look at all stats, we have a list of all those players sorted by points. And this is just a plain, a normal Power BI table that I've configured. So this goes to show that with a bit of creativity, you can make the default visuals work for you and do really interesting stuff. Okay, so that is one. The other thing I want to show you using SVG is this piece of work I've done for an Italian startup a couple of years ago. And these guys basically apply machine learning to football. And what they do is they analyze huge amounts of data for every football match. They will basically measure how well a player performs, and they will also predict how that player would perform in future matches, in different formations against different opponents. So really clever stuff they're doing. My task was to get all of that data and to make a front-end report to place it. So as you can see in the GIF I'm going to play now, I'm selecting different formations, and then the squad gets drawn here on the pitch for that formation. And you can see the player's name, the photo, and also their score, which is drawn using an SVG element. So this is another example where you'd be hard-pressed to find a default visual that could do this kind of thing for you. And this here is a bit of the Python code that I've written to select the top 11 players for each formation. And this will cycle back to show you, again, the squad being drawn. So another example with SVG. I'll move on to this one here, which is something I've published just a couple of weeks ago. This one is pretty simple. It shows train performance using the same data that train stations here in the UK use and phone apps. So there's a very useful API that makes that data available. So I tapped into that and I was trying to measure if I go from station A to B, in this case from Euston to Glasgow Central, what are the chances that my train is going to be late? The SVG, I'm going to show you that in a second. The SVG elements came in on the train ticket. So if I zoom in, this background will never lose resolution because it's drawn on SVG. So that is the big advantage of this technique. So to show you how this works, if I'm going from London Euston to Glasgow Central in either of those times, and I see my train times, this means that if I took the train at 7:30, there would be a 46% chance I would get on time, which would be 12:02. And if I keep moving through the report, I'm going to see other times, and this is actual data, this is real data, the same you'd see at train stations at the time the trains are departing. So it's quite interesting. This screen, this station screen, was done with a different technique I'm not going to be talking about today. But again, I hope this also shows you the type of thing you could be doing with SVG and other techniques inside Power BI to do some very different reports. It's not something you do in a normal business context, but it just goes to show the functionality you can build into these things. And the final case study I will show you on SVG is this right here, which is something we've done for a client on the nuclear sector. I have anonymized all the data. It's actually dummy data at this stage. And what they were trying to do was measure the results of surveys they were conducting in the business and seeing the evolution of the responses to those surveys. So we have 5 strategic areas on the left, and then on the right-hand side, we basically have a breakdown of the questions that went into that area. So if I select governance, we had 6 questions there, and if I select culture, we have 8 questions, and the light bar was the first measure, and the second bar was the last measure for that survey question. Then the SVG element comes in on the left-hand side of this presentation. This is basically a hybrid where we wanted to go for this look and feel on the bars on the left. And then the right-hand side is a very simple bar chart that achieved what we were looking for. Here at the very top, we can select different business units, and this can be seen as departments inside the company. So you can select that, and you can even filter for specific report dates. So not very complicated, there's not many things the user can do, and that was exactly the goal for this report. So what I'm going to show you now, if I click back to Power BI, is a Power BI desktop file that generated this, so you get a better feel as to how this could be done in a more practical sense. So the first thing I tried to do was on the configuration side. So we already know we're going to use measures to do this, and to try and reuse as much code as possible. This configuration here will decide or define what the height of the bars. If I change that to 70 pixels, you should see that all the bars will get updated, and they all shrunk a little bit, as you saw. Then if I look into an individual bar, for example, this first one, strategy. So that's the code that goes into generating the bar. It looks more intimidating than it really is. So we're only doing 2 or 3 things very similar to that example we saw with the circle. It probably just has more layers to it. So here at the very top, I am defining a few variables for the colors of the bar. So for example, if I change that to be red instead, and I recalculate this measure, what you're going to see that I'm starting to change the parameters of that first bar. And then if I came here, and this section right here is really the heart of the whole bar, because each bar has 6 points and it's coordinates basically. So if I change one coordinate right there, you'll see what I mean. So I'm changing the pixels there, and you will see the results straight away. So I'm starting to change the shape of this, and you're not limited to points. You could do circles and arcs and rectangles. You could get really creative with this stuff. The advantage is after you've done it, if, for example, you change the business units, that will still respond to the new data because it's all calculated dynamically on top of the data. So not a very good design decision, but I think it demonstrates the point that it can all be made dynamic. Okay, and then a similar thing was done for the other bars. Okay, let me get back to my slides. And this next thing I'm going to tell you about is a technique I've only recently started using. It's called DNAB. And if I show you here where this comes from, so DNAB is a visual in Power BI that actually allows us to use Vega and Vega Lite type visuals. And this is a framework. They call it a visualization grammar. So it's a set of codes, rules that allow you to generate charts, pretty much like we've done for Python and even SVG. So we're going to see a few practical examples of that straight away. So that's the website I'm also linking to. And if I show you the most basic example you can use with Vega, again, this is an online editor just for the purpose of showing you the building blocks. It's not very complicated in essence, what this requires. So we have a data section, and that data is going to be drawn here on the right hand side. So if I change 28 to 50, so you can see I've just changed that bar right there, and if I change it to 100, as you would expect, that gets changed. So there is a data section, then there is a signals section to these visuals, and you can think of it as dynamic variables. So in this case, if you look at what that's doing, that's basically looking for the mouse hovering over the bars, and then that's triggering an action, in this case, to update the visual. So for now, the only thing that matters that's important is there's this signals that allow us to pass behaviors and variables into our chart, which we're going to see is quite powerful in a second. Then we have scales and axes, and here it's where I say what goes onto the x-axis and into the y-axis, data types, the spacing, we even configure colors and the visual aspects as well. And then finally, the marks is actually what you see being drawn there to represent the data. In this case, it's rectangles, and we just bind the data onto those rectangles to generate the charts. Again, if I change these properties, chart to red, and when I hover, I want to see black. Okay, then you start to see how I'm interacting programmatically effectively with these charts. So that is the most basic example, but let's see how we can actually import that into Power BI, because that's what we want to see. So this example right here is used with the DNAB visual, which, as I mentioned, allows us to bring Vega visuals into Power BI. And I'd just like to make a mention here to Daniel Marsh-Patrick. So we should take our hats off, because he's the author behind this type of visual, and he's done really an excellent job of making this available to the community. He has a website I'm going to show in a second. So he's really done a lot of hard work to make this available to all of us. So really well done to Daniel. So this right here is the most basic type of chart you can do with DNAB using the Vega language. Before I go any further, I'll just mention that as seen on the browser, we have our specification where we define what we want to see. Configuration is where you basically do the visual elements. You can define the colors, you can define the radius, you can define all the visual properties that you will see on the chart. And if you do it here, you just do it once. Whereas if you come here and do it on the specification, for example, for each axis, you got to keep repeating yourself. So configuration is a good practice. If you've done HTML and CSS coding, this would be the CSS element effectively. And the final thing is that you want to specify which of the languages you're using, Vega Lite or Vega. So it's recommended you start with Vega Lite because that's a bit easier. And then if you have more specific requirements, you can go to Vega, but either should work and be very similar to what I'm going to explain to you now. Right, and now you might be wondering, so how is this any better or different to the usual visuals we have already in Power BI? So I'm going to start to show you some of the things you can do here that you cannot do with the vanilla Power BI reports. So I've just copied some code I've written already, and I'm going to try to change the feel of these bars. So if I do that and I turn on auto apply changes, so I've just applied a feel that you could not do otherwise in Power BI. You can do gradients with conditional and conditional formatting, but you cannot apply something bespoke like I've just done there. It is not very difficult. We just need to define the type of field we want, and then there's a background and a foreground color. So if I change that to be red, it's going to get redrawn. And if I change that to be gray, starting again to change the properties. So I'm going to show you now the DNAB website by Daniel that I mentioned a second ago. The tutorials are really good, really clear. And the section I want to look for right now is for these available patterns. So if I look, for example, for a pattern I'd like to replicate, so I want circles 550, and these are already pre-made for us. So if I do circles 550 and I delete that, what we'll see is that I'm again starting to change those properties. It's not a very good design choice, but again, for the purpose of demonstration. So that you could not do in the normal Power BI reports or visuals, I should say. Then if I come here to configuration, something else that you cannot do, and I was actually trying to do this recently and I just couldn't figure out a way, is to change the radius of the bars. So what if I wanted something that looked like that, 20 pixels radius? If I come back to the report, so that is not possible with a normal column or bar charts. You have to use a visual like this to represent that. Right, the thing you might be wondering now is if I hover over this chart here and I click, it's just not showing me tooltips. It's not highlighting as you would normally expect. So to do that, I'm going to move to the next tab. And I'm going to show you that is in fact possible. So if I hover over this bar, I'm going to see a contextual tooltip. This is the normal behavior you would expect. And if I click one of the bars, we have the highlighting and the cross filtering. So this is the normal behavior for a Power BI chart. To do that, and again, Daniel explains how this is done quite well. It's not a lot more difficult, you just got to work with layers instead. So we now have 2 marks instead of 1. And basically what that means is that we have superimposed visuals. So if I select a bar, only that gets shown and everything else is the background elements that I can actually choose and change the opacity. So if I change that to be 30% opaque and redraw, I'm starting to change the hidden elements that get exposed if I select a specific bar. So it's a quite neat trick. And again, Daniel goes into some more detail explaining how this works. With a bit more work, we can make the report be as interactive as you would expect. Okay, now let's have a look at something really interesting that DNAB can also do, and that's mapping. So I wasn't aware we could do as much as this right here, but you can even draw, in this case, earthquakes in a globe, in a world map. And if I change these parameters, you would interact with the visual. And you could even rotate. And you can even rotate again. So let's try to replicate this visual inside Power BI, and this will give us a few more tips and things to bear in mind. So I'm going to copy this into Power BI. And we're just going to edit that code. And the first time I paste this, it will not work. So you can see that there is the sphere is drawn, but I cannot see the countries and I cannot see the earthquakes. So something is going wrong. And if we look into the data, actually the problem is this right here. So the online editor was using relative paths where we need to have a valid URL that my Power BI knows how to interpret. So how do we solve that? If you come back to the online editor, and if we hit F12 to launch the developer tools, so this is something that I'm using on Chrome, but every browser would have a different shortcut, and most modern browsers have developer tools right now. So if we refresh that page again and come here to this network tab, let's just wait a second for this to load. So what's happening here is that I can see all the artifacts, all the scripts and artifacts that this page loads. And what I'm interested in is that right there, that JSON file that has all the countries. And the other thing I want to see here is earthquakes.json. That's also something I want to see. So if I grab this one right here, no, that's the link I'm after. This stuff will get processed by the visual. I don't have to worry about it. And if I now go back and replace my link, but in the quotation marks. Right, so making some progress. The countries were generated, so that bit is recognized. That's good. And now if we do the same with the earthquakes, we can apply this dynamic layer on top. And voila, so this is now working in Power BI as well. Now, an optimization could be, if you notice, this is what I believe is a static file. I don't think Vega would update this very often. But if we do some investigation, we can actually conclude this file right here comes from a website called USGS, and that's the US Geological Society. So I've done some investigation and I found they have very interesting data feeds. In this case, we can look at earthquakes in the past day, past 7 days, last month. So what I'm going to do now is actually make our charts fully interactive and up to date. So this API is updated as new earthquakes happen. So if I have this link in my reports, it will show me up-to-date earthquakes, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to replace the static link with a dynamic API link. And if I've done that right, yes, I'm now getting up-to-date data, and it will refresh as new data gets released by USGS. So if we come back to the reports, so now we've brought that into our Power BI reports. Just a little note, if you want to do something like this, so accessing external resources, you're going to need to use the standalone DNAB version, because the one you get from the software store is going to block any links to the outside world, and that's to basically prevent any security problems, and that's how the visual gets certified. So if you want to do this, you will want to use the standalone version instead. Right, and I was wondering if there was a way to make this a little bit more interactive. So let's say I don't really want to be scrolling left and right and up and down. Why can't I just move this here with a mouse like a normal chart would do, or a map would do? So if you come here to the example library in Vega, we can see that we have here a zoomable world map. And this one here is interactive. So this is the sort of behavior I'm looking for. And I can even zoom in and out, pan left and right. So if we investigate how this example is generated, we come back to our signals. So those interactive or interactive variables. So it's actually all this stuff right here is what's responsible for that behavior. So what I've done already in Power BI is I've copied all those signals, and I've created this new tab, Globe Interactive, which, if it works correctly, we can already see I'm zooming in and out with the mouse, and I can use it to go left and right which I couldn't do before. So we're making the report a lot more interactive this way. And again, you might be wondering, okay, why am I going to do a map or a globe? There's potentially other tools that could do it, and that's right. Some of this stuff overlaps with other things you might find out there. But the point I would make on that is that you can make this fully customizable or customized, and that might not be necessarily the case with a visual someone else has done for you. So for example, you can even change the colors and let the user change the color if you want. You could change the grid type. The mesh could be any mesh you want. The country's borders could be thicker or thinner. And if you hover over the countries, you can even define how the border looks like. I could take it further. I just didn't spend more time on it, but you could have tooltips on top of this that shows you a description of the country and some data for that country. So the point of using something like DNAB is that it's fully customizable and you control 100% of the behavior. That can make the reports really, really powerful. All right, I see I have around 20 minutes to go, so I'll try to show you a couple more things to leave some time for questions. What I would like to finalize by saying here on DNAB is the other type of stuff you can do with it. So here at the top, we have some fairly basic example from bar charts to line charts to some scatter plots. But if I come down here, you'll start to see very interesting things. For example, this one, airport connections, is a map of the US. And if I hover over these cities, I can see how those airports are connected amongst each other. So something that serves a very specific purpose, that's true, but that you can do probably in any other way. So I found that one quite interesting. The other one that caught my eye was this calendar view. I could think of a few uses for something like this. In this case, it's trying to track the stock market changes, S&P 500. So you can see it's almost like a heat map in a calendar where you can see the volatility of the stocks. Very interesting use. And the final thing I will show you is that someone even created a fully functional Pac-Man game that I can control with my keyboard. And please don't put Pac-Man on your report. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm just trying to prove that it's really, really powerful, and with some creativity, and if you spend enough time, you could make really, really interesting things that you could not do otherwise. I don't think I'll beat my record today. So if I come back to our presentation, there's a couple more things I'll show you. This one a little bit quicker. This one is called Microsoft Charticulator. A little bit of background on their website here. This is actually the result of Microsoft research projects, and now they've made this visual or this tool available to us inside Power BI as well. So I'll show you a quick demo of what you can do with it. And I want to go to here, Microsoft Charticulator. And I'll be trying to generate a very simple chart that looks like this, a lollipop chart, using this very simple data. So I have sales by country, and I'm going to try to replicate that in here. So the first thing you'll want to do is to add the data to the visual so that it becomes available for us to work with. So I want country and I want units sold. And then if I edit, there's three main building blocks inside this chart type. That's the glyph. And the glyph, if I demonstrate what it does, is how the data will be represented. That's a rectangle, or if I use a triangle, then it's going to be drawn as such. See, it already knows I want to draw 5 data points, and that's 1 for each country. So what I'm going to do for now is draw a simple line there. Then I'm going to start to change the properties of these lines. So the first thing on the color is I'm going to draw country on top of the stroke color. And you can see, I'm sure if that's visible, that's already starting to change the color. So that's basically a dynamic way to affect the properties of the chart. Then what I want is actually to draw this on the y-axis. Now I need to make each bar the length of the sales, which you can do simply by dragging. Oh, sorry, it's units sold. Drag units sold there, and you can see they're already starting to look more like the sale for each country. But I still don't know what these things are, so I'm just going to simply drag country there. Can give it a little bit of space. It lets me do it. I'll just put it there. Then you can configure properties like, if I find my line right there, I should be able to change this to be a bit thicker. And the final thing I will want to do is to add a circle to sides, which I'm going to make a little bit bigger. Something like that. And the color I want to follow the same as for the line. And why not make the line even more different? So if I select the line again, let's say we want a dashed line. All right, so let's say we're happy with our results. I'm gonna hit save. By the way, you can export this and then import visuals you've already done, so it's quite flexible like that. And what you achieve is basically a fully interactive visual. If I scale this, it will respond. If I select a country there, it will also respond as you would expect a normal chart to do. So that's Microsoft Charticulator. I don't have a demo on this one. I just wanted to bring it up as an option for you guys as well. And if we come back to the final thing I want to tell you about today, which I won't go into a lot of detail, is just for completeness. If after everything we've just seen, there's still a use case, there's something you're trying to do that none of these techniques will work, then this is your final alternative. You could use the Power BI SDK, the software development toolkit. And that's not something I've used in earnest, to be honest, because everything I've shown you has done the job for me effectively. But this is how the other developers launch new visuals to the App Store. They would use the SDK to do that. I will just say this really does require some pretty strong programming skills, and it's not something that's going to enable you to go as fast as the things we have seen today. So there is that to bear in mind. But it's definitely an option there and can solve those scenarios that we haven't covered already. All right, I think we'll leave some time for questions. That is me, and happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Flavio. Round of applause for Flavio, everyone. Fantastic. It's definitely a session we've all been waiting for. You've really shared some really insightful tips there, Flavio. So thank you so much. There are some questions here in the chat. So the first question by Phil Harris is, can you share this report? I need to do my FPL for the 22-23 season.
I can definitely share. This is actually shared. I've put it on my LinkedIn, and this link is public, and it will also be shared with the presentation. So Raz, are we intending to share this to people? Is that how it's going to work?
Yeah, Flavio, so if you could share your blog, I will share that to everyone. So if you could share your link to your blog as well as your LinkedIn social media so that people can get it directly from you. Is that okay?
That is perfect. I'll drop that on the chat as soon as we wrap up.
Fantastic. Excellent. So Vikash asking, such a cool one. Please do publish and let us play with it. Yeah, fantastic.
I will do, yes.
Okay, so Luis Rodriguez is asking, would you agree that with advanced techniques, drill downs can be challenging as data needs to be filtered based on selections?
So you do have a point there. For example, let me bring up the DNAP visual we started with looking at. So if you go for the basic option, this is the one I've shown you. Oh, actually, that's drill through enabled. So Yeah, what I was going to say is that you need to do a little bit more work to make them dynamic, but as you can see out of the box, this report is already suitable for drill through. So I believe it depends on the type of technique you're using. If you try this with the SVG elements, you're not going to be as lucky. So you do lose some interactivity if you use that. Perhaps DNAB could plug that gap where you could have SVG elements, because effectively you could achieve the same visual outcome and still enable the functionality. So you're not wrong in that you need to be careful with the types of solution you're developing. But if we've done what we started by talking about the requirements gathering, you would know ahead of time that, for example, drill through or tooltips are a requirement. And if that's the case, then you would choose the technique that's appropriate for that requirement. But that's definitely a very good point to bear in mind.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions? Let's see in the chat. So we've only got a few more minutes left for this session. Great feedback from Rob saying his mind is blown. I think someone does need to drop a suitable GIF image. I mean, here. Yeah, just to kind of represent how we feel after that session. I think the classic, I think this is the classic here. This is the classic one, Flavio. You know, so yeah, so that represents how we're all feeling right now. Fantastic.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. Excellent stuff. Okay, so any other questions? Uma is asking, thank you so much, Mr. Flavio. Wonderful session, a lot to explore. Yeah, it is definitely an art form, I have to admit. Once you get into the you know, these visualizations, it definitely is an art form, and I really appreciate Flavio sharing his personal tips and tricks. Okay, so we've only got 5 minutes left to the next session. So Flavio, do you have any announcements or any information you'd like to share with the community?
Right, thanks everyone for joining. I'll just drop the link to the slides and to my LinkedIn, and then you can explore further in your own leisure.
Excellent. Well, Flavio, it was a great pleasure to host you today. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of you, hopefully in person next time. So don't forget to follow Flavio. I'm sure, you know, he's definitely a community rock star, and I'm sure we'll be seeing him a lot in the near future. Thank you, Flavio.
Okay, thanks everyone. Cheers.
Awesome. Fantastic. Okay, great stuff there. So we're on to our last session of the day, guys.